And welcome to this edition of the Native News Update on this Wednesday, March 6th. I am your host for today's program, Paul DeMain, and many of the stories right here can also be found at our website, IndianCountryTV.com. And here are some of the news stories for the day. Indians and non-Indian protesters on the Red Lake Reservation in northern Minnesota continue their campout started last week near 4 pipelines owned by Enbridge Corporation in hopes that it might slow the flow of Canadian tar sands oil across the United States. Marty Kopanes, a Red Lake tribal member and office manager for the Indigenous Environmental Network, says the 4 pipelines built in 1949, 1958, 62, and 1972 are illegally sitting on 8.5 acres of Ojibwe Reservation land. Enbridge spokesperson Becky Haas says the pipelines were built on land that had received proper easements, permits with recorded real estate records, even though Enbridge does not own the property the pipes are on. Red Lake Tribal Chairman Floyd Jourdain Jr. said in an email that the protest is not sanctioned by the Red Lake Nation, that the Tribal Council had attempted meaningful dialogue with Enbridge before breaking talks off in the past and then ordering them to vacate tribal lands. Meanwhile, in Madison, Wisconsin, more protests are planned for Thursday, February 7th as a controversial open-pit mining bill comes to the Assembly floor with provisions that prevent any more debate. The bill, expected to pass and be signed into law by Governor Scott Walker within days, is widely opposed by Chippewa tribes and residents of northern Wisconsin, where the mining impacts will show up the most, the Bad River watershed. The bill paves the way for the world's largest open-pit mine to be opened by West Virginia mountaintop coal miner and billionaire Chris Klein and his Gogebic Taconite Mining Company. The Illinois Environmental Protection Agency notified the Macoupin Energy last December, one of 4 mining companies Klein owns in Illinois, that it believes the company has been dragging its feet with the cleanup of groundwater pollution in the Shea 1 mine in Carlinville, Illinois. Senator Tom Tiffany, the Senate sponsor of the bill, said last week that it was the legislature's intent to allow for environmental degradation in order to prevent the state from being sued by outside parties or by its own citizens for negative environmental impacts. Republican senators voted down 18 amendments to Bill SB 1 that would have provided for Wisconsin workers' first clause at the mine and allocated millions of dollars to educational and training facilities in the region. The bill passed the Senate 17-16. 3 former Blackfeet tribal leaders have reached plea deals in federal charges they held illegal big game hunts for country musicians and outdoor television show hosts by allowing them to shoot elk, moose, deer, and a black bear on the reservation without a license. Former Blackfeet Tribal Business Council members J. St. Goddard and Jay Wells and former Tribal Fish and Game Director Gail Skunk Cap Jr. held the hunts in 2010 and 2011 for up-and-coming stars including Josh Thompson and Justin Moore. The men exchanged the hunts for concerts by the country artist and for exposure on the show called Sovereign Sportsman, available on DirecTV and Dish Network. Federal prosecutors say that amounted to an illegal sale of the tribe's wildlife. Attorneys for St. Goddard, Wells, and Skunk Cap Jr. filed the proposed settlements last week with federal prosecutors. The deals call for the men to plead guilty to the illegal sale of wildlife and theft from a tribal government receiving federal funding. The U.S. Attorney's Office will drop 4 other charges under the plea deals. Arizona tribal members say they're shocked by a television sitcom that made fun of one of the most pervasive social ills on reservations, alcoholism. One of the characters on the CBS show, Mike and Molly, joked last week about drunken Indians in Arizona. Navajo Nation spokesman Ernie Zah says while alcoholism is easy to judge from the outside, the disease isn't funny. He says it can lead to assaults, break up families, and instill fear in children. Hopi tribal member Rachel Povita says alcoholism often is tied to a history of trauma for American Indians. She says tribes struggle to find enough resources to address it. The Native American Journalists Association says CBS should apologize. CBS spokesman Chris Ender declined to comment on March 4th. Venezuelan authorities launched an investigation on March 4th into the shooting death of an Indian chief who had repeatedly requested protection from the government as he campaigned for indigenous rights in a largely lawless and increasingly violent region. Information Minister Ernesto Villegas says Sabino Romero, a leader of the Yakpa tribe, was fatally shot March 3rd along a highway in the western state of Zulia. Villegas said investigators suspect Romero may have been the victim of a hired killing, but authorities have not determined a motive. The Prosecutor General's office issued a statement saying that Romero reportedly was gunned down by two assailants riding a motorcycle. Justice Minister Nestor Rivero suggested that owners of large swaths of land located along the Piria mountain range may be responsible for Romero's murder. And today we talk with Shoshone-Bannock blogger Mark Trahant about the budget cuts now in place through the Sequester, a big word for budget cuts, and where will we see them in the very near future. Thanks for joining with us today, Mark Trahant. You've been covering this whole issue of austerity and sequestering. Tell me a little bit about that, but let's give our watchers today here a little idea about what sequester mean. Where the heck did that word come from?
Well, it's from a Latin, basically means to hold a hostage, and in this case the hostage is money. And what it is going back into the budget and taking out a percentage and returning that to the Treasury with it unspent. In this case, it's $85 billion. Half of it was to come out of the Defense Department and half of it from domestic discretionary funds. Now, what makes that problematic is that 2/3 of the budget is entitlements, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, and they're not being touched by, except for some minor programs being touched by that sequester. So its impact is pretty deep, and it averages to about 5% for most programs, and in many cases it's money that they're seeking right now, that even if it's by contract or by other means, depending on the structure of that deal, the money has to be returned.
Okay, so what it is a big budget cut and return of unspent money.
Or before you spend it money, yes.
Before you spend it. It's not returned unspent money, it's money being grabbed and yanked out of the budgetary system where it's already been approved previously in budget resolutions.
Right, and it's for this fiscal year, so it's between now and September 30th, so it's a crunch.
Okay, so the sequestering deadline has passed. Sequestering or budget reductions or return of funds has begun. I was reading that United States Immigration had let thousands of immigrants being held in facilities released because of this. They didn't have the money to do that. What are some instant things that we might see around the country, and we'll get to Indian country in a minute, but what are we going to see around the country first?
Well, instant, it's more like, imagine walking into a room and when you're back at the fuse box flipping a series of fuses and that room goes dark. That's kind of what it's like. It's not all at once. It's going to be random, and it's going to be the lights going off for a minute and then something else. Some immediate ones are really minor. Most of them, they have to give notice. For example, federal employees will be furloughed, meaning they'll have to give up a day of week of work in some cases, which is a 20% pay cut. But that won't start until at least April, because you have to give proper notice before you can do that. Closing of airport towers is one example of that. There are just different mechanics that will take place almost immediately.
And you're saying 2/3 of the budget is hands-off, so right. All these cuts fall on the 1/3 that's fluid.
Exactly.
What are we looking at Indian country? We're just saying a 2.5% to 5% cut out of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, education, housing?
Right. It's about $130 billion for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Interior Department, and more than that for the HHS and the Indian Health Service programs. At first, we thought that HHS would protect Indian Health, so it would only be 2%, the same as other entitlement programs. But they ruled it was an appropriation, so it was the full 5%. Uh, the one program that's not touched in that deep a way is the Special Diabetes Initiative, and that's being cut at 2%. Indian Health actually has some options going forward. They're complicated, but as more and more clinics shift to Medicaid funding, there will be the opportunity to continue to grow the program. And that's really where the emphasis has to be, is looking for Medicaid dollars rather than appropriated dollars.
And in other parts of the budget, is it simply going to mean that the Bureau of Indian Affairs at Washington, D.C. will be operating at 95% of its budget? Or are these things going to reach right down into the floor, into the Tribal Program Administration?
They will reach into tribal programs, no question about it. The big impact immediately is employees, is a lot of employees are going to be furloughed. And I know the perception is that federal employees make great wages, and it's a good deal. And that's true. But at the same time, if you're a family and you got maybe a kid in college or two kids in college, as I'm about to, and all of a sudden your pay goes down 20% with a month's notice, that's a big hit. I don't care who you are. That's something you're going to feel. One of the real impacts in education will be almost immediate is impact aid, where on particularly large land-based reservations, because counties can't collect property tax, they get some money from the federal government for that. That's going to evaporate. You look at school districts on the reservation, say at Navajo, and 100% of their students are impact aid. And so their budget is 60, 70% from that federal account, and all of a sudden it's going to go down by 10%.
And those will be the public schools
Right.
systems that are serving Native students.
Right.
And to some extent, some of these programs will be taking double and triple whammies, won't they? They're going to lose the impact aid. They're going to lose federal program monies, issues of busing cost, issues of school lunch programs.
Right.
Are all going to be impacted, so it's a collective thing. Now, a lot of people said that we were running up to this deadline. It felt more like a crisis. Now it's 5 or 6 days after that cliff, and there seems to be this calm settling in that somehow says maybe we're going to get through this, or we're just going to deal with it.
Well, one of the ironies of federal management is that when a crisis like hit, the managers warn that it's going to be bad, it's going to be bad, it's going to be bad. And then when it hits, they try to manage through it. And we're at the point now where they're trying to manage through it. They're looking for solutions to kind of get us through this period of time. The House of Representatives just a few minutes ago voted to pass a continuing resolution for the rest of the year that locks in these cuts through the rest of the year. So unless the Senate takes a very different stand, this is probably the way it's going to be through October. But more important, the Budget Control Act, which is the law that sets these into place, is a 10-year bill. And so the types of budget cuts we're seeing now will continue to ratchet up for the next decade.
What in the next couple of weeks, are we going to see any other things coming out of either the White House, Senate, or Congress that shift some of these budget cuts? We've heard a lot about Republicans wanting to reinstall or reinstate some of the reductions that are coming to the defense military budget and so forth. What are they going to be willing to trade off to do that if that's the case? Or is it a situation where this thing is going to stick across the board and the Democrats to some extent will get their quote-unquote defense spending reductions?
I think that's the way it's happened. The bill that passed today does have some provisions for the Defense Department to move accounts around, but it's really limited. And the House, which is the most conservative part of the government, has basically said this is the way it's going to be through this budget cycle.
What's the first thing you're going to see for your back pocket? Where are you going to see it? Have you seen it yet, or where are you going to see it? When you go to the clinic, or how are we going to notice this?
Well, I think at the reservation level, you'll notice it with employment when tribes. I mean, one of the really crazy things is normally if you're a manager and you have a big budget cut, you look to lay off people. But laying off people is expensive. And this budget cut is coming so fast that you can't lay off people. And so they're going to try to do it all with furloughs. They're just going to cut people's pay. But beginning in October, we could see actual layoffs and reduction in jobs that people are counting on.
So we may see it in limited hours of clinics being open, maybe reduced hours, reduced doctors being available, or nurses or other things like that.
4-day school weeks. I mean, all those kinds of things will start to be a way for people to manage it. One of the areas that's getting hit really hard is Department of Defense schools. And they're impacted both by the funding levels and the teacher salaries. And so they may have to be the first schools to go to 4-day weeks.
Okay. Well, is this something that's going to be a long-term solution to the deficit? Does that, or is this just one kind of like one whack at it and that's over with for right now?
You're asking the wrong person. I think this is total nonsense. I think we have a long-term spending problem that has to do with demographics. And the way we fix that long-term problem is to lower the cost of healthcare. None of this does anything in that regard. In fact, I think by the time all the numbers come in, this measure will cost more than it saves. The economy, the CBO says 750,000 jobs will be lost. You think about air traffic towers and that sort of thing. And that's a big hit to any economy. That means lower tax revenues. That means it's a cycle. The whole world is in this trend of austerity, and it's not working anywhere, and yet we're emulating exactly the same mistakes that are occurring in Spain, in Italy, in Greece, and hoping for a different outcome.
Okay, well, we'll keep an eye on it. You see any surprises coming up in the next couple of weeks, months, out of that hill over in Washington, D.C.?
I think we need another election. I think it's going to come down to another election.
And it's going to come down to another one of those little split things where the country is split down the middle again?
Well, as long as we keep doing that, we're not going to get anywhere. We need to get an election that's decisive.
All right. Well, we'll keep in touch with you. If anything drastic happens, give us a ring. We'd like to know. And otherwise, we're ready for the budget cuts. We're going to watch to see where they come from.
Very good, Paul.
Thanks, Mark. And that is another roundup of news from Indian Country. On this edition of the Native News Update, we want to say miigwech for joining with us and come back again soon.